I've been fenced in today, so we can't wander as much. Today we're going to be continuing on with the same thing we started doing last week, looking at one aspect of the Christmas story, of the Nativity story, and then going back in the Old Testament and looking at the significance, and saying, why is this significant? And then bringing it today and saying, why is it significant for us today? Last week we were actually in the exact same passage, but we just focused in on one part. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? And we went back to the Old Testament and we looked at not all of them, but some of the Old Testament passages that talk about the coming King of the Jews. And then we talked about just the significance of our life for today, how he's not just the King of the Jews, but he's a King for all people. He's our King. And today we're still in the same passage, but what we're going to be focusing on is the three wise men, the three magi. We have a map here. The first thing we're going to look at is, what does the Bible passage tell us in Matthew chapter 2 about the wise men? Because it gives some of the significance of this. It says they're from the east. Well, what is east of Jerusalem? Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq. And I know most of you probably just looked at this map this week when you're planning your family vacation for next summer, right? Well, most of the people who write commentaries, who study the Bible, believe that the wise men were from Iran, which was Persia back then. But regardless, they're from one of these countries. So here what we have in this story is this. We have three Arab men, most likely Persian, who see something in the sky. They see a star. And it communicates two things to them. One, a king has been born. And two, he's King of the Jews. The king has been born. He's King of the Jews. And they're so certain that this star communicates this, that these three men travel across the desert to come to Jerusalem. So what's significant about that? Three Arab men see the star that communicates King of the Jews. And they come to the Jews and tell the Jews, they ask them, where's your king? And the Jewish people, the Israelites, go, what? What star? And then they start going into the Old Testament and looking for prophecies to figure out where the king was born. So the significance of this is it's three Arab men who see the star that God put in the sky. It's not the Jewish people. And for the significance of this, what we're going to do is we're going to go back to one passage in the Old Testament. There's lots of passages we can go to, but we're going to go to one, and we're going to focus on what is the significance behind this. What can we learn about God by the fact that there's three Arab men who saw the star and came to Jerusalem. So the passage we're going to be in is Genesis chapter 12, and it's on page 11 in your Pew Bible if you want to turn there, because this will be the main passage that we look at today. In Genesis chapter 12, God is talking to Abraham. Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. He's the father of the nation of Israel. He was the very first one. Every single person who is a Jew is a descendant of Abraham. And in this passage, God is telling Abraham, I want you to go out from your people, and I will take you to a land that I will make your own, and I will bless you, and I will make you a great country. And he says all of your descendants will basically become a great nation. But what we're going to focus on in this passage is God promises Abraham three things specifically. So I'm going to read it. Verse 1, the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So the first thing God says to Abraham is, I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. And the first thing in the promise, we see God's intent. Why does God bless Abraham? God blesses Abraham so that Abraham will be a blessing. And that's what God's saying from the very get-go, and it's a principle for us we see throughout Scripture, throughout the Bible, is that when God pours out blessing, He does it for a reason. He pours out blessing so that we can be a blessing. And that's the first promise that God makes Abraham. I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. The second thing He promises then is, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And what God is promising is, Abraham, your descendants will be the nation of Israel, the country of Israel. And all the other nations of the earth that bless you, God says, I will bless. And all the nations of the earth that curse you, I will curse. And this is really significant because just this week, this has begun to have implications for us. And I had already picked this passage before this week even started. So as I watched the news this week, I saw the significance of this and felt like this is something that we're supposed to go into because the passage has already been picked and then this happened. But for those who didn't see in the news this week, Donald Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And for those of you who don't know all the backstory, like I didn't, and I read it, most of it this week, knew some of it. So here's a quick recap with most likely all the details close to 100% correct. But after World War II, the Jewish people, all the Jews, they went back to Israel. They didn't have a country up to that point. And it's actually prophesied about in the Old Testament that after Jesus' day and age, all the Jewish people, the Israelites, were going to be spread all over the world. They were going to be dispersed. But after a time, towards the end, they were all going to come back. And after World War II, in the 1960s, that happened, where they all went back, and they formed a nation again. Well, that made the surrounding nations very upset, the Arab nations, and they attacked the Jewish people. And what happened was, it was like the 7-Day War. The Jewish people were attacked by several countries, and yet they were victorious. And they only owned half of Jerusalem, and they were attacked, and yet they won back land. They won East Jerusalem. Well, this made all of the surrounding Arab nations extremely upset. And they said, in 1967, if anyone declares that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, you're declaring yourself an enemy of us. Because that's our land, and they took it. So ever since 1967, no country was willing to say, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Because they knew it would make a lot of people really upset. So all the countries would have their embassies in Tel Aviv, and they would send a consulate to Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem really was the capital, basically. Well, this week, Donald Trump declared that the United States is now going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And the exact same thing happened that they said was going to happen. All of the Arab countries are extremely upset. Most of the world, extremely upset. So the significance for us is, this is a promise. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Israel feels that what we did this week was a blessing. So we can find hope in the fact that although a lot of people are really upset, God says He will bless those who bless Israel. So we can take comfort in God. Not in our country keeping us safe, not in Donald Trump keeping us safe, but in God. Because that's what all promises go back to. That ultimately a promise is only good as the person who makes it. So if God promises us this, we can find hope in God, we can find trust in God, we can find security in God. Everybody else in the world, all earthly kings that we looked at last week, will fail us. God won't fail us. So let's take comfort in this. I feel like after I go into that, I have to regroup a little bit, because that's very significant, because it's happening right now, and most of you might leave and that'll be the only thing you remember today. So in terms of trying to refocus, what we're talking about today is the 3 wise men. 3 Arab men who saw a star that communicated, King of the Jews. And they were so certain that they traveled across the desert to Israel to ask the Jewish people, where is your king who has been born? And then we went back to Genesis chapter 12 to look at the very beginning of the Jewish people, the very beginning, the forming of the nation of Israel. We looked at how God says, I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Well, the third promise God makes you and this is the one we're going to be focusing on today, is all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So we see this principle of God saying, I will bless you so that you can be a blessing. And then God begins to explain how far that blessing is going to go. He's saying, everyone, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Well, the Israelites, they grabbed on to part of this promise, but a specific part of the promise. They didn't grab on to the end. They grabbed on to the, I will curse those who curse you. So was their attitude, oh, may we be a blessing to the nations? No. It was, God, you need to curse them. Curse them. And one of the passages we see this in, we see this attitude come out very clearly, is in Luke chapter 4. It's the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. What happens in this passage is Jesus has just grown up. He's now 30 years old. So most of his life we don't know anything about. But when he's about 30 years old, he begins full-time ministry. He begins to travel around and preach and teach, and he recruits disciples, and he begins his full-time ministry. Well, the very first thing he does in his ministry is he goes to his hometown, and he stands up in the synagogue, and he goes to the front to read from the Old Testament. And he picks up the scroll, and he unrolls it, and he starts to read from Isaiah 61. And it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He's anointed me to bring freedom for the prisoners, light for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And what's interesting about this is Jesus picks up the Bible passage in the Old Testament, and he starts to read it, but he doesn't finish it. He kind of cuts off mid-thought, and he rolls it back up and puts it down. But the next phrase he left off was the passage from Isaiah 61 said this, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. Well, Israel really liked that. Why? Because it was about vengeance. Because it was about wrath. And who's going to get vengeance and wrath? Those dirty nations. And that's what they had grabbed onto in the Old Testament, as we see, is they were supposed to be a light to the nations. They were supposed to be a nation of priests. But instead, they had pulled back, and they would rather see the nations cursed than they were blessed. So what Jesus says is, I'm here to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then what Jesus does is he goes in and gives specifics. As if they were unsure of what he was getting at, he's like, let me fill you in on something. In the Old Testament, Elijah, in his day and age, he helped a widow. Well, in this time, there was a huge famine, and there was lots of widows in need in the nation of Israel. But did he help any of them? No. He helped the one from Sidon, which is modern-day Lebanon. He helped a foreigner. What about Elisha? There was lots of lepers in his days that were Jewish lepers, but did he help any of them? No. Who did he help? Naaman the Syrian. So Jesus gets up, and he doesn't say the statement about the day of vengeance of our God. He just says, I'm here basically to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And then he says, and that Lord's favor, it's not just going to go to the Jewish people, it's going to the people from Lebanon, it's going to go to the people from Syria. And what he does is, he shows the promise of Abraham, where God says, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. And what Jesus is showing is the people in the Old Testament, the prophets, the Jewish prophets, not only blessed the Israelites, they also blessed the nations. But the Israelites, the Jewish people, when Jesus said this, they were so mad at him that they grab him, they take him to the edge of town to throw him off a cliff. This is the first day of Jesus' ministry. Luke chapter 4. And they're ready to throw him off a cliff because he told the Jews that basically God wants to love the nations also. And they're like, you're going to die for that. What I love in the end of that, in Luke chapter 4, is it says, here's this angry mob ready to throw him off a cliff, and he somehow just walks through their midst and walks away. So the promise of Abraham, that last part, all the nations of the earth would be blessed through you. That is fulfilled in Jesus. Ultimately, Jesus showed that even in the Old Testament, God was using the Jewish people to bless the surrounding countries. But in Jesus, all the nations of the earth are blessed. All the nations of the earth now have a Savior. Not just the Jewish people, all the nations. So what's the significance of the wise men then? The significance is this. Do you think the Jewish people would have gone to Iran to tell them about Jesus? One, they couldn't have, because they didn't even see the star themselves. But two, their attitude was not an attitude of, may we be a blessing to the nations. God is blessing us so that we can bless the nations. That was not their attitude. Their attitude was curses. So the beautiful part of this story is God put something in the sky to draw 3 Arab men who never would have heard about Jesus, who never would have heard the gospel, who never would have been invited to this. God drew them, miraculously, with a sign in the sky. So these 3 Arab men, who would have lived their entire lives serving pagan gods, doing who knows what, are drawn by God Himself to the birth of Jesus so that they can worship Him as King also. So what's significant about this in our day and age? This stuff still happens. Iran. Do any of you know that right now there's a great awakening going on in Iran? Where Muslims are coming to know Jesus by the thousands. How many of you know a missionary in Iran? There aren't very many. How are they coming to know Jesus then? Through dreams and visions. Muslims are having dreams. Jesus is appearing to them, and He's saying, follow me. And they are. So the same thing we see here, this principle of God works miraculously to draw 3 Arab men to worship Jesus. Now He's doing it through dreams and visions. Or the woman, the leper that Jesus mentioned. He was from Syria. How many of you know missionaries 10 years ago who were in Syria? Not many. So here's this group of, I believe about 10 years ago as a country, 12 million people or so, who lived in a place that they were not going to hear the gospel. What happened? War broke out. Civil war. So what happened after that? This group of millions of people leave the place that they won't hear the gospel, and they begin to disperse all over Europe and all over the world to places that they will hear the gospel. And this was happening when we were living in Romania, and we had colleagues all over Europe, and they were saying these refugees would come with nothing. And it was the Christians, the churches, who reached out. Everybody else wanted nothing to do with them. The Christian reached out. And thousands of Syrian refugees, who never would have heard the gospel in their own country, came to a place where they could hear the gospel, and they too could worship Jesus as their King. One of my friends from Romania, his name is Răzvan, he was a Muslim, and he was so devout, he traveled to Mecca on the Muslim pilgrimage that all of them are supposed to do. And while he's in Mecca, doing a pilgrimage for Allah, he's walking towards the mosque, and all of a sudden he sees a vision, and follow me. And he stops what he's doing, and he turns around, and he flies back to Romania. And he gives his life to Jesus and serving him. And now he's in full-time ministry. This God who drew the 3 Arabs who were never going to be told by the Jews because the Jews hated them, he drew them to Jesus. And today, that part of the world where we showed the map to the east of Jerusalem, there aren't very many Christians who will go there. Why? Because today we usually don't call them the Arab nations, we call them the Muslim nations. But what God is doing is the exact same thing he did back then. He is working miraculously so that all the nations can be blessed through Jesus. He's saying, if we're not willing to go, I'll do it myself. Because I made a promise to Abraham that day, that through you, every single nation on earth will be blessed. And they're all going to be blessed through Jesus. They're all going to come to him. Every nation will bow their knee to Jesus. So as we leave today, what's the one thing that we can do? How is this significant for us? Because most of us will most likely never be a missionary to the Middle East. In our community, we might not even meet any Muslims. But we have a God who has a heart. And his heart is this: I am here to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And that's what we live in. We live in the year of the Lord's favor, where judgment and wrath, they haven't come yet. And until that day comes, God's heart is that all the nations will be blessed and come to Jesus. His heart is not that they would be cursed. There will come a day where vengeance and wrath will come. But until that day comes, God's heart is he wants to see them blessed with knowing Jesus. Let that be our heart too. I mean, right now there's so much on the news about this nation surrounding Israel, and they're really upset about this being declared as their capital now and all these things, where there's unrest. May we have a heart that God has, a heart of love and a desire to see them blessed with the knowledge of Jesus, just like those 3 wise men who traveled across the earth. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you're such a good God. And we thank you that you showed us this story of how you drew men to yourself. Men who never would have known you, men who never would have heard about your birth, men who never would have saw that you are a king for all nations. But you reached down into this universe and you drew them. Because you desire all the nations of the earth to be blessed, all the nations of the earth to know Jesus. We just pray today that you would give us your heart, that we would have the same heart as you, that we would desire all the nations of the earth to be blessed by you and to know you. That we wouldn't desire curses, but we would desire blessings for them. And we just ask, Lord, that the blessings you've given us, you would show us how to use those to bless others.